Hello everyone, welcome to another video on my channel. Today's video will be about the Reichsreform, or how the empire began to deal with the problems of the modern world as states began to centralize and as the scale of warfare began to increase in the 15th and 16th centuries. So the 15th century is a kind of local nadir of imperial authority. The only comparable period would be the late 13th century. In the 15th century, you get the Hussite Wars, which basically deprive the Emperor Sigismund of his hold on Bohemia for some time. You have widespread chaos in the forms of small private wars in the Rhineland, in Bavaria, and other parts of the Reich. And perhaps most importantly, many of the imperial regalia, or lands that were attached to the imperial crown as such, had been alienated in the preceding century, that is to say the 14th century. And what I mean by that is that Emperor Charles IV, King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor, in the 14th century, had sold or pawned off a lot of the territories that belonged to the imperial crown directly, and this meant that all future emperors would have to rely on their hereditary lands in order to prosecute the various duties of their office. Now, by 1453, you have the end of the 100 Years' War, and you also have the seizure of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. And during this period, the arch-sleepyhead of Austria, Frederick III, is the Holy Roman Emperor. And he is in something of a tough geopolitical situation, because all he really controls in the empire is Austria and a few scattered territories to the west. And in fact, he doesn't even control Austria proper or Tyrol initially. These are under the control of collateral relatives of his. He is only really the ruler of Inner Austria, that is to say Styria, Carinthia, Istria, Carniola, that whole area. And so he's in a very, very, very difficult situation, and he has to figure out a way in which he could shore up imperial authority and defend the empire against new threats. And these new threats are the Ottomans, as mentioned, who will eventually, before long, end up encroaching on the eastern frontier of the empire. Another threat is the rise of France as a centralized state, having just ousted the English. And the other threat is the Burgundian state off in the west, which encompasses in this period both the Duchy of Burgundy in France, as well as much of Benelux and much of northeastern France. During this period, Burgundy especially is known as the Turk in the West, because it had been expanding its own authority through a combination of purchase, outright annexation, marriage, bullying, and what have you, in the western portion of the Holy Roman Empire, in an attempt to connect its northern and southern territories and reestablish the old kingdom of Lotharingia and make itself into a potential claimant to the imperial throne. Now, in France, as you can see on this map, we have a case where the crown controls most of the country relatively directly, which is a far cry from what we see in the empire. Now, we should not compare Austria to the light blue territories directly. Frankly, the light blue territories were probably controlled more directly than the Habsburgs controlled Austria. And so, in fact, this kind of understates the differing levels of authority that the Valois dynasty in France and the Habsburgs had over their respective domains. Now, in order to better understand how the Reich was functioning in this period, we should define a term, and that term is territorialization. Territorialization is the process by which various estates in the empire, like Saxony or the Palatinate, consolidated their holdings and increased their authority in those holdings, turning their scattering of non-contiguous rights, estates, mines, and so on into contiguous and semi-sovereign territories. into things that approach what we would consider to be states. Now, if we look at this particular map, we can see the partition of the Saxon territories under the House of Wettin into the Albertine in yellow and the Ernestine branches. And we can also see that they held various territories in common. And this could often be a source of conflict, the way these different lords had overlapping jurisdictions with one another. In addition, the legal systems in these territories were not uniform, and they were very fragmented. And there'd be a lot of conflict between the nobles of these territories and the princes who presided over these territories. Now, these princes tried to consolidate their authority in such a way as to introduce uniform legal systems and uniform government. But this was an ongoing process which, even as late as 1500, was not even close to completion. And this is to say nothing of rival states and minor states, which also had overlapping claims and jurisdictions with these princely states. And finally, you have the church, which had overlapping jurisdictions with these states. These territories would naturally have churches and parishes within them, and prince-bishops would also have dioceses, which had spheres of jurisdiction which went far beyond the territory of their principalities. And this was also a potential source of conflict between princes and the church, which is one of the many seeds of the Reformation, which I will discuss later in the video. Within this confusion, the Habsburgs, and Frederick III in particular, would find their opportunity to increase their authority, leveraging the conflicts between various estates, and also leveraging their need for defense and their overall legitimacy as emperors to sort of reform the empire into something viable in the context of increasing centralization and the increasing scale of warfare in this period. An early model for this is the Swabian League, which was a league in southwestern Germany of various cities, counties, and principalities founded by Emperor Frederick III in 1488 AD. This league was an alliance, but it functioned in many ways like a federation, having colleges of cities, counts, and princes who could come to a consensus and make decisions through a somewhat democratic process amongst themselves. And in this, they were all presided over by the emperor. And this organization was used, one, as a means by which Frederick III could project his authority throughout southwestern Germany, and also as a means for these various estates in the region to protect one another, especially against the encroachment of the Swiss Confederation in the south and the Duchy of Bavaria in the east, and potentially any threats that might arise from the north or northwest. However, the Habsburgs had tremendous difficulty projecting any power outside of the southeast and southwest. Southern Germany was really their power base. And what would allow them to start projecting power in the rest of the empire was the acquisition of Burgundy. Now, in 1477, the last Valois Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, dies against Lorraine and the Swiss at the Battle of Nancy in a fateful cavalry charge. And he leaves his lands to his daughter, Mary the Rich, Mary of Burgundy. And she ends up marrying the son of Emperor Frederick III, the future Emperor Maximilian I. Now, the Burgundian state, which is itself a patchwork of various states, not a unified centralized system, something called a composite monarchy, is partitioned between France and Maximilian. Maximilian more or less gets what corresponds to parts of northeastern France and Benelux and the Franche-Comté in the southeast, whereas France gets the Duchy of Burgundy proper around Dijon. Now, due to this inheritance, the Habsburgs are able to somewhat more or less double their income from about 1 million guilders a year to about 2 million guilders a year. And this allows them to run a network of protection and patronage and management and supervision from the northwest, which will extend throughout the Rhine. And so places like Munster, Cologne, Jülich, Cleve, Berg would all become clients of the Habsburgs through this Burgundian inheritance. And this would leave the north center, where you have things like the Duchy of Brunswick, and the northeast, where you have things like the Electorate of Brandenburg, as places which are somewhat distant from the emperor and difficult to manage or influence. Now, in 1495, after various wars in Italy and against the French and also against the Hungarians, Emperor Maximilian, his father Frederick III, having recently died, calls the Diet of Worms in 1495. And at this diet, he tries to come to an agreement with the princes that the empire is in need of reform. The princes and other estates all recognize that they need the emperor to protect their own liberties, and the emperor realizes that he needs money from the estates in order to prosecute his wars in the west, the east, and the south. And now, the estates at the Diet are somewhat suspicious of Maximilian. They don't want their money and troops to go to fulfilling his own personal ambitions in Italy and Burgundy. But they also recognize that they need the empire. And so what are they to do? Well, initially, they come to an agreement that, one, feuding is to be outlawed, and so they establish what is called the Ewiger Landfried, the perpetual peace. And so all things which had hitherto been resolved with private warfare are to be resolved through the Reichskammergericht, the Imperial Chamber Court, which is established at the Diet of Worms. And also the common penny, which is a capitation or poll tax, which is to be levied on all adult males in the empire without exception, and to be collected by princes and by the imperial church, and then handed over to the imperial treasury. Unfortunately, the princes are kind of reluctant to hand over money, and so are the other estates, and so are the imperial knights. And this is despite the fact that they agreed to this. And what's funny is that despite the fact that contemporary critics of the emperor and later German nationalist historians in the 19th century, despite what they claim, only about 1/40th of Maximilian's total income ends up coming from this tax at first. It only yields a measly 50,000 florins a year because so many people just refuse to pay. Now, something else that is proposed at the Diet of Worms, but not accepted until later at the 1500 Diet of Augsburg, and then it won't be accepted for long, is something called the Reichsregiment, which just means the imperial government. So this imperial government, made up of 20 members, is to be established at Nuremberg, and it is supposed to be presided over by the emperor, but be made up of 20 representatives of the princes and other estates. And they are to control the budget, the collection of the common penny, the Gemeiner Pfennig, and also foreign policy. And now to Maximilian, this is initially unacceptable because he wants to increase his own power, and he doesn't want a kind of written constitution or law that would set his powers in stone and set clear limits on his power. And he wants to sort of bide his time so that he can win his wars and increase his power so that he can get a more favorable deal from the estates. And even though he does concede for financial reasons to the creation of this Reichsregiment in 1500, he repeals it 2 years later. Not only because he sees it as a limit on his power, but because the various estates ended up not really liking this imperial government any more than they liked the emperor. And they don't end up being much more successful than he was in collecting taxes. And so this tax ends up having to be repealed. Now, one successful legacy of the Diet of Augsburg in 1500 is the establishment of the so-called Reichskreise, or imperial circles. Ultimately, there would be 10 circles. Initially, there were only 6. These consisted of the Burgundian circle in the northwest, which only consisted of the Burgundian inheritance held by the Habsburgs. The Austrian circle in the southeast, which encompassed Austria and various other imperial estates in the region, very small ones like the Bishopric of Trent. You had the Bavarian circle, which was dominated by both the Duchy of Bavaria and the Prince-Bishopric of Salzburg. You had the Franconian Circle, the Swabian Circle. These are more decentralized, as is the Lower Saxon Circle, where you have the Duchy of Brunswick and various bishoprics and small states. The Upper Saxon Circle is mostly dominated by the Electorate of Saxony, the Duchy of Saxony, and also the Electorate of Brandenburg. You have the Upper Rhenish Circle, which includes people like Hesse. You have the Electoral Rhenish Circle, which includes 4 of the prince-electors, the Elector of the Palatinate, and the Archbishop-electors of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. And then finally, you have the Lower Rhenish Circle, which includes the Prince-Bishopric of Liège, which is a kind of enclave of the Burgundian territories, as well as Munster and various other territories in the region, like Cleve, Jülich, Berg. And these are somewhat modeled on the Swabian League. They're run by regional diets, which work together to collect various taxes, and these entities are organized for the purpose of common defense and protecting one another's territorial integrity and mobilizing troops for the emperor when necessary. Now, due to the mutual distrust between Maximilian and the various imperial estates, the early attempts at imperial reform end up as a little bit of a failure. As stated before, the imperial government ends up being abolished. The perpetual peace is something which takes a while to fully establish, and at first they have to create various exceptions because there is no way of enforcing it initially. For example, imperial knights are still allowed to feud under certain not very well-defined circumstances. And of course, the common penny, which would eventually be replaced by a more workable tax system, ends in almost complete failure, yielding very little money to the imperial treasury. Now, as a kind of prelude to my next video, I'm going to talk about the church a bit. Now, from the Concordat of Vienna in 1448, the imperial church ends up in a somewhat unique position in Christendom. Throughout the rest of Western Europe, the churches are being consolidated under national bodies, which are usually under the supervision of a monarch. In France, the pragmatic sanction of Bourges leads to the formation of the Gallican Church, which is under the management of the King of France. Similar things end up occurring in Spain, especially after 1492, when the Iberian Wedding takes place. Similar things end up happening in England. They start happening in Poland. But the imperial church remains mostly free of imperial control and is mostly directly under the Pope. The Pope retains a kind of veto power over the choices of cathedral chapters, but the emperor's interference is mostly excluded from the running of the various prince-bishoprics. However, many of the churches in and around the important territories, such as Magdeburg and Passau and other various churches that are inside the territories, like various parish churches, are brought under firmer control of some, but not all, of the princes, particularly Brandenburg and Austria. And this sets a precedent for what would later occur during the Reformation. There are many, many, many reasons why the Reformation occurred, and I will go into it in my next video, most likely. But one of them is the problem of overlapping jurisdictions, which I mentioned earlier, and the desire to territorialize and consolidate one's holdings into more contiguous and uniform and sovereign territorial entities. Parishes, which will be partially subject in previous periods to the local prince-bishop, whose diocese, like I said, extends well beyond the borders of his prince-bishopric, will be forcibly subordinated to the local prince who controls the territory. And local princes will likewise use whatever little authority or ties they have to smaller abbeys and churches around their territory to force them to submit to their own. And the Reformation is the perfect pretext for that. Bishops are sort of seen as having abdicated their duties by being bad bishops and by teaching false doctrine, and so it's the perfect opportunity for the princes to subordinate the churches to their own authority. And this is in opposition to the emperor subordinating the churches to his own authority, which was certainly a major goal of Charles V, which I will discuss in my next video. Now, the election of Charles V in 1519 is an incredibly interesting affair, which I will explain in more detail in my next video. But basically, his credentials as a German candidate, despite the fact that he was born in Flanders and was the child of a Spanish princess and a half Burgundian, half Austrian man, as well as lots of money from Fugger bankers, gives him an edge over his rival, Francis I of France. And perhaps more than any Holy Roman Emperor before him, certainly more than any Holy Roman Emperor since Frederick II, he brings more resources to bear, especially relative to the various princes and estates, to the imperial office than any emperor before him. You know, he is the heir to Spain. He controls Spain, Castile and Aragon. He has claims to, or already controls, vast swaths of Italy. He controls much of the Burgundian inheritance. He controls Austria, although he quickly delegates that to his brother. And then a question arises, will he be able to force the princes to come to heel? Will he be able to prevent them from forcibly reforming their own churches and asserting their own independence? And will he be able to make them smarten up and serve the common good of the empire? And that is something that we will discuss in my next video.